Good afternoon, everyone. Pleased to be here. And my comments before, I'm a little nervous standing in front of you because we have been at such granular, fine scales trying to understand the biological and chemical and abiotic processes that lead to what we're trying to quantify and account for at very large scales. And so bear with me when I talk about this stuff. I've been doing this now for probably 8 years. And I always say we need to arrive at simplicity on the far side of complexity. I also say too that the pioneers get the arrows and the settlers get the land. And I feel like in Alberta we're sure getting a lot of arrows. So I'm not going to talk a lot about Alberta, but just around what's been working in Alberta. And I'd also like to tell you that the area that I've been working in is looking at BMPs and seeing if the science is robust enough to bring them into an accounting framework that works for carbon, a project-based accounting framework. But bear in mind, those BMPs have had years of research and testing and implementation before they're ready to be integrated into a system where you're looking at the net changes in all of the 3 greenhouse gases that affect agriculture: methane, nitrous oxide, and CO2. So the discussions we've had this morning are we're just on the verge of research and developing those BMPs and making them practical for farmers. So there's a ways to go. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the global context and what the government policy response, Ian gave you a taste for that, and then get into some of the accounting policy and market considerations for agriculture to bring this as an incentive forward to recognizing some changes or some carbon sequestration. And so this I've taken from the 4th assessment report of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. And this is a panel of scientists that convene every 4 or 5 years. They go over the research that has been done, and they come up with general accounting and formula procedures and guidance on how to quantify greenhouse gas emissions. There'll be a methane table for agriculture, there'll be a carbon sequestration table, there'll be a nitrous oxide table. Many scientists from Canada and the US have participated on those panels. And so it's a synthesis of best available scientific procedures. Countries take those methods and they develop their national emissions inventories and customize it to conditions. And so our inventory group in Ag Canada takes those and produces a national emissions inventory and customizes those equations and formula with activity and science that's based in Canada. This has been an invaluable resource for us to move forward in trying to assess the quantification of the net impact of GHGs. Now, bear in mind, these are done at very large scales. They're spatially averaged over time and temporally averaged to get the actual outputs of the small, fine, granular things at a level that's spatially averaged, temporally averaged, and conservative, but is representative of what goes on annually in the country. So here was the co-chair of the 4th Assessment Report Agriculture Chapter, Dr. Daniel Martino, and I got this slide from him with permission, and he was the co-chair with Dr. Peter Smith. Remember that name because it'll come up later. He's from Aberdeen, Scotland. And so the 3rd assessment report for agriculture had looked at using these accounting procedures and quantifying what the potential could be for carbon sequestration. And it was a very broad theoretical quantification in the 3rd assessment report. In the 4th assessment report, Dr. Peter Smith and the science colleagues on that table decided they would actually look at the constraints and what the price of carbon might bring forward as a stimulus to increasing soil carbon sequestration in general and from agriculture and forestry. And we'll talk about that in a minute, but what the various sectors could provide. Note here that in the developed world, it is not as significant as it is in the developing countries, and that's largely because there has been a lot of soil degradation, and there's concern about soil degradation, and we need to improve that. But at these prices of carbon, they felt that there could be an actual contribution of global carbon emissions quite significantly. But at the same breath, Dr. Martino said, I'm going offline now because that was my UN IPCC hat. We have an opportunity, that was largely missed by Kyoto. And Raul, you were talking about the afforestation, reforestation on sequestration. It didn't go anywhere for a number of reasons, I think. Temporary credits might have been one of those as the sale. But here, if we looked at the economic potential, and Dr. Martino had done the number crunching, we could have a significant impact on the billions of tons that are emitted every year. So kudos to Gord and company for saying let's start a dialogue on sequestration, because I think it's important, but also note that a lot of this potential is going to come from developing countries. So why then is carbon pricing so important? I think you got a flavor of it from Ian earlier, because if we look at the policy tools that are available to government, we could impose technology standards or command and control standards through regulation, and industry will go, well, how do we implement that at the lowest possible price? And you're going to get people begrudgingly going on and doing it, but it's going to take time, and there's going to be regulations and enforcement. We could set performance standards, and then if you're setting it like, we don't want to say this is what you're going to use as the best available technology, we can actually say, here's what we're looking for in terms of an outcome, like maybe reduce carbon intensity. Then industry will ask itself, okay, what are the suite of technologies available? So there's some choice, there's some flexibility, they're going to be shopping around. Or we could move to carbon pricing, and this is where the thought process goes around carbon pricing, is where do we invest and deploy the best technologies, because now we have a return on investment that may happen as a result of that from putting a price on carbon and saying carbon is no longer free, so those that can innovate and can move forward will be driven and motivated to do so. So that's the thinking behind a carbon pricing mechanism. And so it's sort of simple in terms of how it's implemented. In Canada, we have 690 megatons of CO2 with carbon being emitted free to the atmosphere. And now what we're going to do is say, well, there's a carbon price that needs to be placed on that. It's no longer free. And it's going to cost to emit each ton of CO2e. And that's what we have in Alberta. We have 100 facilities that are capped at a certain intensity level, albeit it's an intensity target, but they can't go above it. Every year they must go below it by 12%. And then you've got carbon and materials. They're starting to factor this into their business decisions now and starting to account for it. That's why the chartered accountants in Canada, the US, have carbon accounting principles now and direction in their procedures. Then industry will say, well, you know, it's kind of costing us now. We're going to start to invest in finding new solutions to this. And these are the cap sectors. Outside of that are the opportunity for those sectors that don't have targets, like agriculture, to participate by reducing emissions through improving management on their operations. And just a global snapshot, Ian touched on this. This clean development mechanism that Raul was talking about, that's set up under the United Nations framework on climate change, and it happens in developing nations, and technologies are implemented there. The credits flow mainly back into the EU emissions trading system, but you can see that all over the world, they're starting to move forward with the cool farming initiative in New Zealand, Japan. China even is setting up programs and registries for carbon trading. And then in North America, we sort of have this interesting mix of things that are stopping and starting, and basically looks like this. We unfortunately don't have a comprehensive Pan-American, nor do we have a Pan-Canadian or Pan-US. But we've got a lot of activity going on, and we've heard about Quebec and Ontario and California. I think Quebec and California now are the only ones out of the Western Climate Initiative that are moving forward with the timelines for regulations and legislation set to start January 1st, 2013. And Ian did a nice job of covering the carbon tax here and the voluntary offsets. And then in Alberta, we've got 4 years running of a compliance-based system for offsets. And so we've got a lot of activity happening, and there's a little bit of confusion around what counts. Everybody's developing their different standards and protocols for quantifying carbon. It's not a perfect world. So Raul pointed out standardized baselines and how that can allow people to implement things on a practical level. And so what's happened in Alberta, if we take a look at the various compliance options, the large final emitters have the option to pay a $15 fee into a fund, which Susan is here, and she's going to be working on the biological side of that fund. And they can undertake internal improvements. Most of this is cogeneration on coal facilities and oil sands. They can purchase offsets, or if they go below their target, like if it's 12% and they get like a 14 or a 13%, they have a credit to sell. So the only thing that's selling in that system is credits. Notice how offsets have grown over time in our compliance system. They have become quite popular in our compliance system. And now we have about 31 protocols for the system to use. About 15 of those have been implemented of various project types, and it looks something like this. And so the reason I think that we've seen this large proportion of carbon soil sequestration is we have a standardized baseline approach that was developed by Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada and the Emissions Inventory Group. It goes by regions of implementation, and it rewards producers for soil carbon sequestered. And it works quite well in the prairies, because in the prairie soils, no-till works well. It's not, they're semi-arid soils. You don't run into some of the problems here that you have in Ontario with subhumid soils. The N2O emissions can be quite high given the potential for flash off of N2O. And it might eclipse the carbon. And I think some of the testing on that protocol that was developed nationally that Alberta implemented has seen that, you know, maybe the no-till situation in all types of soils and climate combinations in Ontario hasn't been the best. So I'm going to change gears a little bit now and get into some of the details as much as I can in 20 minutes. So I did a national study with my colleagues for the Climate Change and Emissions Management Corporation, because in Alberta we're focused so much on energy, and our plan talks about, you know, greening fossil fuels and energy efficiency for clean energy, and it doesn't talk a lot about biological reductions and what the biological sector can contribute. And so we did this large study for, and it was a national study, in terms of what's the potential for biologicals in Canada, and the problems that we saw. Why this sector hasn't been mobilized to some degree through carbon financing incentives, even, you know, a carbon market or others, is that a lot of the estimates we've seen in the past around Canada's forest potential or Canada's soil potential have been very large gross estimates at theoretical levels. If you've talked to Dr. Werner Kurtz lately with Natural Resources Canada, right? He works for the forestry side of the federal government. Canada's forests stopped being a net sink in 2006. It's an older stand of trees. They respire more than they sequester now. And so that's the realities of the situation. So, you know, once you start to look and bring in some of the accounting criteria that's developing globally, well, people are looking for stuff that's beyond business as usual. You need to deal with the permanence of that stored soil carbon. And many of these registries and programs are coming up with mechanisms to do that, to address permanence, and we can talk about those at the break or whatever. You need to think about, is what you're doing causing an activity shift somewhere else with higher emissions? And I'll get into that. I think Dr. Lehman did a very good job of saying, you know, for biochar, we need to understand the emissions profile of where those feedstocks went before, and then what that is now in biochar, to really get a handle on, is it a real, measurable, quantifiable reduction? Uncertainty is large in these discussions for carbon. And Dr. Ferroni, I found the study, and I know it was the context of this study was they looked at paired sites. So yes, if you took soil samples from way back when and you looked at them today in cultivated soils, they look really low. But if you compare them to corresponded cultivated sites over time, those sites were, the old sites were still sequestering carbon under a management scheme. So it's about the comparison. So just a clarification, I was a little bit wrong there. And so the barriers, really the constraints boiled down to in that large report, obviously a lack of enabling public policy and political will to move these things forward at a domestic level, internationally. A limited understanding of the range of practices and technologies with a clear assessment of their potentials. That lack of credible measurements of emission reductions associated with those practices and technologies, and the accounting frameworks and the life cycle emissions assessment that need to go with that. And confusion around the types of accounting carbon frameworks that are out there. You're getting different carbon footprints for milk from 5 or 6 different agencies, or beef. That's some of the difficulties. And then sort of this lack of a coherent and coordinated approach. If we had standardized methodologies for doing LCA assessments, if we had standardized protocols that everybody would use so there weren't different numbers out there, it would really help. I'm just going to go on what's the bar. So what are those accounting frameworks saying? Well, in the case of the carbon financing world, it's got to be beyond business as usual. If we're going to ramp down our trajectory of global carbon emissions over time, we've got a curve. We've already accounted for, under that curve, everything that people are all going to be doing out in the future. And so, you know, if people have adopted, some programs are very strict. If there's a 5% penetration rate of that technology, they go business as usual. In Alberta, we say if there's a 40% penetration of that technology, it's business as usual. So people are really cautious about not double dipping, I guess, if you will. If they were going to do it anyway, we're not going to ramp that down. It can't be surplus to regulations or received incentives. This real, measurable, and quantifiable, this is the Achilles heel, I think, in terms of making sure that we're accounting for all greenhouse gases on a net basis. And I'll get up into that in a minute. So we can't just focus on carbon. We need to focus on the other greenhouse gases in order to be credible and real. And the verifiability of this is no small task. And so the streamlined implementation of standardized baselines that are accepted by the program, saying this is the coefficient, let's say, for this region, that's what people implement. And so the government has set it. And that's really important. And we're seeing all of these programs say, I think we need to move to standardized baselines, realizing that they may be conservative and they may not be as aggressive in the carbon yield as we like, but it's safe, it's conservative, and it's credible, and it's defensible. Permanence, it's getting, okay, thank you. And really important for agriculture is we've got to reduce the footprint. We're not going to stop producing food, but we've got to get more efficient at producing it. And so that emissions intensity per unit of production is really how we should be measuring these things. A brief word on the accounting systems. In agriculture, we not only look at one gas, we have to look at the impacts of management on all those gases that are happening on that landscape. Then, in order to be credible in this LCA emissions world, we need to go upstream and downstream and look at quantifying what those impacts are. And I'd say even scope 3, which are very rarely done here, what's the materials that went into the trucks that are hauling the feed, and what's the fossil fuel extraction emissions? If you wanted to do the full life cycle, that's a little sometimes onerous, but in agriculture it's usually soils to farm gate. You don't see them going very much farther. In accounting for carbon, you need to go farther. And so that IPCC group, basically they've identified 3 tiers of accounting for carbon. The one that's making most sense for carbon accounting in LCAs and in carbon finance is using this sweet spot of spatially averaged and temporally averaged, that high-level ecosystem analysis that comes out of all that granular stuff that we understand. And the way people are doing that is they're using, biogeochemical process-based models where they've been well-calibrated at the fine sites doing research, and then embedding those into the protocols and applying them across regions. I'd be remiss if I didn't say that what governments have started, corporations will take farther, and it's important for agriculture to understand this. So here I'm taking an example of a supply chain initiative. I'm using milk in the US because it's an industry level set. There are food supply corporations like Unilever, Nestle's, Walmart that are doing this for their supply chains. And they're finding that most of the emissions, they can control the emissions corporately, they can control the emissions in their transport fleets and do reductions. They are realizing that 70% of the emissions of their products, are coming from the primary sector. So now they're looking to do LC analysis and find management practices that will reduce things on farm so that they can report on their corporate social responsibility initiatives. So this LCA on carbon says, we understand from crop production and milk production, we need to do these sets of reductions, and the industry and dairy has said, that's where we're going to find them. They haven't gone upstream to look at what goes into fertilizer fuels, et cetera, in manufacturing. So we have a difference in it. But just some examples in the North American context. Here we have a company who's going to start putting carbon footprints on their food labels. the World Wildlife Fund has targeted 15 commodities of agriculture globally, and they're working with not, as they say, 8 billion shoppers or 8 billion, or what is that, 1 billion producers worldwide. They will work with the tops of those supply chains that control 70% of the choice, and that's where they'll target it, and that's where they're doing the carbon accounting, amongst other things. Unilever has a large stake in this in terms of moving along the sustainability chain. PepsiCo, again, these are the corporations, and Walmart. And so this will drive things down the chain. Here, the dairy industry is now supporting their farmers through LCA assessment, soil carbon modeling, and management changes. So a sector-level approach to help people meet these is important. And here, Dr. Peter Smith, that fellow from IPCC, and John Hillier with Unilever have developed the Cool Farm tool. And that is a farm-level GHG calculator that they are using, and it's very coarse, it's very granular because it's global. But that's what those corporations are beginning to work with their producers on, to find ways to reduce GHGs. So these guys have deep pockets, they understand LCA analysis, and so we have to be really careful. I think, Ian, your comment about be careful what we do here, because these guys are worried about greenwashing. That's the last thing we want to have happen here, right? Anyway, Ontario opportunities. Sometimes difficult for no-till. I think someone mentioned nitrogen today. I think there's an opportunity from the perspective of carbon to look at reducing the carbon footprint of Ontario crops and in implementing nitrous oxide reduction protocols that focus on end-use efficiency in the 4R technology platform being promoted by the nutrient industry. Oh, and just that, this is the emission factors from the inventory. You guys have a great opportunity here. Here we're so dry, we don't emit a lot of nitrous oxide. So even if we change the practices, we can't reduce a lot of N2O. However, with your subhumid soils, you can. And it's here, it's ready, start it, pilot it, see how it goes. Also, from the point of view of increased soil carbon sequestration, our table had a good discussion this morning. The problem with traditional amendments like manure is the carbon accounting will balance out. Where did that manure go in the baseline? It went onto the soils, right? So even if you said, okay, well, I'm going to put it on new agricultural soils, you still need to, in that accounting framework, go, okay, but those soils you were putting it on are now they're not gaining carbon to the same extent, but then these ones over here are gaining, it's a wash. And so that's what the accounting frameworks do when they look at upstream, downstream. And so really what happens is you can change the storage or how you're managing that organic amendment that usually goes on to soils in agriculture. That's an opportunity. And the biggest one that I see, and we've been talking about it a lot today, is diverting organic wastes that might go from landfill, that have high energy and nutrient values, that get clustered in municipalities. Think where all of the products that come into a center like Toronto don't go back out on the land. And if we can start to look at different ways of processing those, even biochar, construction and development waste, we can actually boost energy, green energy, and start to take a lot of those nutrients, stabilize them with compost or biochar to boost the nutrients. And we need the LCA accounting to do that. I think this is the big ticket, really. That's it.
Questions for Karen?
Just a clarification on one of your pie charts for nitrous oxide, with the 19% coming from crop production systems, or are there protocols implemented in the livestock sector as well that is contributing to the reduction of nitrous oxide?
Yes, in some of the protocols that I've seen, there are N2O emissions that are accounted for in reducing those. But liquid manure storage, liquid manure emits more greenhouse gas emissions than solid. And so the large thing that comes off of liquid manure at the storage level is methane, usually. If you can decrease the crude protein contents going into the animal through altering the diet, then you get reduced N excretions out the back end. And then when you go to apply it to the land, and you've implemented the feeding strategy, you get lowered N2O emissions.
Over here? Yep.
You spoke about the standardized baselines, and I was wondering about Alberta's experience when you design your standardized baselines and looking at the thresholds. That's some of the issues that a number of markets they struggle with in fixing a threshold of a certain variable that needs to be put in place in order to know that whether you are within or outside the standardized baseline. Is there any experience like Alberta can pass on to you?
It's more of a practice-based linkage. And so are you implementing the practice appropriately? So that's more of the indication. The standardized baseline is there. And so the thing that triggers the coefficient is, are you doing the activity appropriately? And that's where the verification comes in. A, are you using the right coefficient for the standardized baseline? And B, are you implementing that practice appropriately that links it back to the scientific method of quantification?
It's context-based.
Yes, yes.
Wait, oh, sure, go ahead.
It's like being in Alice in Wonderland listening to this.
I was afraid of that. B.
A budget yesterday that said nothing about climate anywhere. There's no political will to move forward on any basis in Canada for the next number of years that I think would give it legitimacy to doing something in this area that you're describing. And may I also say the notion that Walmart, McDonald's, Unilever, anyone else is worried about greenwashing. Glad to hear that you think they are. But to have them
what I said.
drive or be the driver for moving ahead to do some of this very detailed, which would have to be bulletproof, fraud-proof,
Yeah.
fiasco-proof exercise for a few bucks. I just find this whole thing absurd.
Yeah. You know what?
And
Oh, sorry.
So the careful comment when we speak before is resonating. And I'm not saying this because I think that there is an opportunity. I think there is, and I think it's useful that you've got the view, looking at where others have tried this. But I really think Ontario, I hope Ontario farmers, and I think Ontario as an example, or an opportunity to do something value-based, mission-driven, and potentially, real. I hate to use that word because John Baird used to talk about that missions all the time. It's total bullshit, for example. But
Is the camera on?
Need somehow or another be linked back to what someone this morning was talking about in terms of soil security and food security, and not who gives a shit what Walmart wants.
Yeah, I know. And I'm not going to go there. I'm going to let Don go there, because Don's going to be able to speak to that more than I am, because Don and I work in those circles in the U.S. and hear those discussions. So, I applaud the dairy industry in the U.S. because they set their own standard and they're taking their own actions, and WWF is backing off. But you either have an incentive, I guess, through this, and I'm not sure carbon is the right incentive, or the supply chain dictates to you.